A well driller drills down. That's the job. Straight down through soil, through clay, through rock, until the bit hits a zone where the rock is fractured or porous enough to hold water. The water fills the fractures. The well casing captures it. The pump lifts it to the surface. The deeper you drill, the more likely you are to hit a water-bearing fracture, because more rock means more chances. Drill deep enough and you'll find water almost anywhere. That's the driller's guarantee. That's the driller's confidence. And that's the driller's fundamental assumption about how water works underground. The assumption is usually right. On flat ground, in sedimentary basins, in the alluvial valleys, where most people live and most wells are drilled, water moves vertically. It percolates down from the surface, through soil and rock, until it reaches a saturated zone, the water table, where every fracture and pore space is filled. A vertical well intersects the water table and draws from the saturated zone. Simple, predictable. Drill down far enough and you hit wet. But mountains don't work the same way as valleys. In the Blue Ridge Mountains of Virginia, the folded, fractured, metamorphic rock that has been pushed and compressed and heated for 500 million years, water doesn't always move down. It moves sideways. It follows the bedding planes of the rock, the tilted layers that were once horizontal, but are now angled at 30, 45, even 70 degrees to the surface. The water enters the rock at the ridge top, hits a tilted impermeable layer, and flows along that layer like water on a tilted plate, downhill, sideways, following the dip of the rock until it exits the mountain as a spring on the opposite slope. A vertical well drilled into a Blue Ridge mountain may never hit that water. The drill goes straight down. The water flows sideways. The drill and the water may pass within 10 feet of each other and never meet, because the drill is looking for a horizontal water table that doesn't exist, and the water is following a tilted pathway that the drill can't intersect. This is what happened on the Pruitt Farm in Patrick County, Virginia, in the spring of 1999. A well driller named Randall Combs brought his rig to the Pruitt property, a 140-acre cattle farm on the side of Bull Mountain. Set up on a site the county health department had approved, and drilled 200 feet of borehole through Blue Ridge gneiss, without hitting a single drop of water. 200 feet, $12 per foot. $2,400. The cost of proving what the driller already suspected at 150 feet, but couldn't confirm until 200. The rock at this location was dry, not fractured dry, solid dry. The gneiss was tight, unfractured, the mineral grains locked together in a matrix that had been compressed by 100 million years of tectonic force. Water couldn't penetrate it. Water couldn't flow through it. Water wasn't there. Mr. Pruitt, I'm at 200 feet, and I've got nothing. No fractures, no moisture, no flow. This rock is tight. I can keep drilling, but I'm running into diminishing returns. The deeper I go in this formation, the tighter the rock gets. My recommendation is to plug the hole and move to a different location. Clyde Pruitt was 74 years old. He'd been on this mountain since 1958. His family had been on this mountain since 1884, and his grandfather, Amos Pruitt, had provided water to the original homestead, not from a well, but from a spring that had been flowing from the mountainside 300 yards below the house since Amos first found it, marked it with a cairn of stones, and piped the water uphill to the house, with a gravity-fed line made from hollowed-out chestnut logs. The spring had failed in 1997, not dried up, failed. The chestnut log pipe had finally rotted through after 113 years of service, and the spring box, a hand-laid stone enclosure that Amos had built around the spring's discharge point, had collapsed, burying the outlet under 2 feet of rubble. The spring was still flowing. Clyde could see wet ground below the rubble, but the water wasn't accessible without excavating the spring box and rebuilding the collection system. The county health department had told Clyde that a hand-dug spring was no longer an approved water source under Virginia's private well regulations. A drilled well was required. Hence, Randall Combs and his rig and 200 feet of dry hole. Stay with me, because what Clyde did after the driller quit and where the water actually was is why this story is about reading a mountain instead of drilling through it. Let me tell you about how Clyde's grandfather found the spring, because the method Amos used in 1884 is the method Clyde was about to use in 1999. And the method explains why the driller went to 200 feet and found nothing, while the farmer dug to 60 feet and found everything. Amos Pruitt was a mountain man, not a frontiersman in the romantic sense, but a practical subsistence farmer who'd settled on Bull Mountain because the land was cheap and the timber was thick and the hunting was good. He didn't have a well driller. Well drilling rigs didn't exist in Patrick County in 1884. What existed was observation, the ability to read the landscape for signs of underground water, and to locate springs by their surface indicators. Amos read the mountain the way a doctor reads a patient. He looked for symptoms. On Bull Mountain, the symptoms of underground water were seeps. Wet patches on the hillside where water reached the surface through thin soil, vegetation changes, strips of dark green growth in otherwise dry forest, indicating subsurface moisture feeding the roots, temperature anomalies, spots on the hillside where the air was noticeably cooler in summer because evaporating spring water cooled the ground, and rock outcrops with specific mineral staining. Iron oxide streaks on exposed rock faces where water had been flowing through fractures and depositing dissolved minerals on the surface. Amos found the spring by following a seep line, a strip of perpetually wet ground that ran along the mountainside at approximately 2,800 feet elevation. The seep line was visible in every season, wet in spring, damp in summer, wet again in fall, and ice-coated in winter when the seeping water froze on the surface. The seep line ran northeast to southwest along the contour, parallel to the mountain's bedding plains, which dipped to the southeast at approximately 40 degrees. The seep line was the surface expression of an underground water flow. Water was entering the rock at the ridge top, 3,400 feet, percolating downward through fractured upper rock, hitting an impermeable gneiss layer at approximately 60 feet depth, and flowing along that tilted layer to the southeast until it emerged on the hillside at 2,800 feet. The seep line marked where the water crossed the surface, the discharge zone of a perched aquifer that existed not at the bottom of the mountain but at the intersection of 2 rock types 60 feet below the ridge. Amos dug where the seep was strongest, a spot where the wet ground converged into a concentrated flow about 4 inches wide. He dug with a pick and shovel through clay and weathered rock. At 8 feet, he hit solid gneiss. At 14 feet, he hit a fracture zone. a band of broken rock where the impermeable layer met the fractured layer above it. Water was flowing through the fracture zone sideways, not pooled, but moving, a steady flow of cold, clear mountain water following the dip of the rock toward the southeast. If you're enjoying this story, consider subscribing to The Average Farmer. We share stories like this every week. Amos built the spring box at the fracture zone, a stone enclosure that intercepted the lateral flow and directed it into the collection basin. The water filled the basin at approximately 2 gallons per minute, more than enough for a household, a barn, and a garden. He piped it uphill to the house, using hollowed chestnut logs, a technology as old as the Appalachian settlements, using the natural rot resistance of chestnut heartwood to create pipes that lasted a century. The spring had provided water to the Pruitt farm for 113 years. Not from a deep aquifer, not from the water table, from a perched aquifer 60 feet below the ridge, flowing sideways through a fracture zone between two rock types. The well driller in 1999 had drilled at the ridgetop, straight down through the impermeable gneiss, and missed the water entirely because the water wasn't below him. It was beside him, flowing laterally through the mountain at a depth and angle that a vertical well couldn't intersect. Clyde understood this, not from geology textbooks, from his grandfather's stories and his own 50 years of watching the mountain. He knew where the seep line was. He knew where the spring box had been. He knew the water was still flowing because the wet ground below the collapsed spring box was still wet. The lateral flow hadn't stopped, only the collection point had failed. After Randall Combs packed up his rig and drove away with $2,400 and a dry hole, Clyde walked down the mountain to the old spring site. He stood at the collapsed spring box and looked at the wet ground. The seep was still there. Water, oozing from the rubble, spreading across a patch of dark green moss that marked the discharge zone. The mountain was still giving water. It was giving it sideways, the way it always had. The driller had gone 200 feet straight down and missed it. Clyde was standing on top of it. Everything was about to become very simple. But Clyde had one thing the well driller didn't. 50 years of watching where the mountain was wet and knowing what that meant. Let me tell you about the dig, because Clyde didn't rebuild the old spring box. He dug a new one, wider, deeper, and better designed than Amos's original. And what he found at 60 feet confirmed everything his grandfather had told him about how Bull Mountain holds its water. Clyde chose a new location, 30 feet uphill from the old spring box, on the same seep line, but at a point where the hillside was steeper and the overburden, the soil and weathered rock above the bedrock, was thinner. He estimated that bedrock was closer to the surface at this spot, which meant less digging through clay and more direct access to the fracture zone where the water flowed. He started with his Farmall 560 and a backhoe attachment, a small hydraulic bucket that could dig to about 8 feet in the soft overburden. The backhoe opened a trench 6 feet wide and 8 feet deep in 2 hours. At 8 feet, the bucket hit solid gneiss, the same tight, unfractured rock that Randall's drill had been grinding through 300 yards uphill. But Clyde wasn't going through the gneiss. He was going along it. The fracture zone, the water-bearing layer, existed at the contact between the tight gneiss below and the weathered fractured rock above. The contact wasn't at 200 feet. It was right here, at the transition from soft overburden to hard bedrock. Clyde needed to follow the contact laterally, dig along the rock surface, not through it, until he intercepted the lateral water flow. He switched from the backhoe to hand tools, a pick, a shovel, and a pry bar. The work was physical, breaking weathered rock at the contact zone, removing clay and rubble from the fractures, exposing the bedrock surface where water seeped from between the layers. He worked for 3 days, not continuously, 6 hours per day, the pace of a 74-year-old man who knows his limits and respects them. On the first day, he exposed the bedrock contact across a 12-foot face. The rock surface was wet, moisture seeping from a dozen hairline fractures in the weathered zone above the solid gneiss. The seepage was slow. Individual drops, not a flow. But the drops were constant, and they were coming from the same direction, uphill and to the northwest, following the dip of the bedding plains. On the second day, he dug deeper into the contact zone, following the fractures that showed the most moisture. At 12 feet below the original surface, approximately 4 feet below the bedrock contact, he hit a fracture that was flowing, not seeping, flowing, a crack in the gneiss, approximately 2 inches wide, with water running through it at a visible rate. He could hear it, the musical sound of water moving through rock, a sound that well drillers never hear because they're 200 feet away on the wrong side of a diesel engine. On the third day, he widened the excavation around the flowing fracture and discovered what Amos had described and the driller had missed: a fracture network. Not one crack, but a system of interconnected fractures in the gneiss at the contact zone. A natural plumbing system that collected water from the ridge above and channeled it laterally through the mountain to the discharge point on the hillside. The fracture network was concentrated in a band approximately 4 feet thick, centered on the contact between the tight gneiss and the weathered rock above. The total depth from the original ground surface to the fracture network, approximately 14 feet at the new location. Not 60 feet. The original spring had been at 60 feet, because Amos had dug from a lower point on the hillside, where the overburden was thicker. Clyde, by choosing a steeper spot with thinner overburden, had reached the same water-bearing zone at a fraction of the depth. But the number that mattered was the flow rate. Clyde set a 5-gallon bucket in the excavation and timed it. The bucket filled in 1 minute and 40 seconds, approximately 3 gallons per minute, more than Amos's original spring, more than enough for the farm, more than most drilled wells in Patrick County produced, 3 gallons per minute from a hand-dug excavation 14 feet deep. The well driller had gone 200 feet, 14 times deeper, and found nothing. The water was never at 200 feet. The water was at 14 feet, flowing sideways, and the driller had been looking straight down in the wrong place. That moment changed everything about how Clyde's neighbors thought about water on Bull Mountain. And the driller who'd collected $2,400 for a dry hole would never forget the farmer who found water with a pick and a shovel in 3 days. Let me tell you about the spring development, because Clyde didn't just dig a hole and call it done. He built a collection system that captured the lateral flow, filtered it naturally, and delivered it to the house by gravity. The same principle Amos had used in 1884, updated with modern materials. Clyde built the spring box from poured concrete, a 4-foot by 4-foot by 3-foot basin, set directly over the fracture network with an open bottom that allowed the water to rise into the basin from the rock below. He installed a screened intake on the downstream side of the basin, a 4-inch PVC pipe with a stainless steel screen that filtered sediment and allowed clear water to flow into the collection line. The collection line ran 300 yards uphill to the house, the same route Amos's chestnut log pipe had followed, but now using 2-inch polyethylene pipe instead of hollow logs. The grade was consistent. Clyde had surveyed the route with a garden hose level, the same method that Emmett Jessup used on his drainage ditch. The pipe rose 140 feet in 300 yards, a grade that natural spring pressure couldn't push against. So Clyde installed a small hydraulic ram pump at the spring box. A hydraulic ram pump is a device that uses the energy of falling water to push a small portion of the water uphill. It requires no electricity, no fuel, and no moving parts except 2 check valves. The falling water, the main flow from the spring, enters the ram, builds pressure in a chamber, and uses that pressure to push approximately 10% of the flow to a higher elevation. The other 90% exits the ram as wastewater, which Clyde directed into the original stream channel. The ram pump pushed 0.3 gallons per minute to the house, approximately 430 gallons per day. More than adequate for a household in a barn. No electricity, no operating cost. The spring's own energy did the pumping. The water arrived at the house cold, clear, and pressurized by gravity from the storage tank Clyde installed in the attic. Total cost of the spring development, approximately $1,400. Concrete for the spring box, PVC pipe, polyethylene line, the ram pump, and miscellaneous fittings. Plus, 3 days of hand labor and 1 morning of farmall backhoe work. The well driller had charged $2,400 for 200 feet of dry hole. Clyde had spent $1,400 and found water that flowed at 3 gallons per minute. The dry hole produced nothing and cost more. The hand-dug spring produced everything and cost less. Let me tell you about Randall Combs's reaction, because the well driller who'd said there was no water drove back to Bull Mountain when he heard what Clyde had found. Randall came in July of 1999, 3 months after his dry hole, and 2 months after Clyde's spring was flowing. He parked at the farmhouse and walked down the mountain to the spring box with Clyde. The concrete basin was set in the hillside, the water rising clear and cold from the fracture network below, the ram pump clicking rhythmically, the sound of water pushing water uphill without electricity. Randall looked into the spring box. Clear water, 3 gallons per minute, rising from fractured bedrock 14 feet below the surface. He looked uphill at his dry hole, 300 yards away and 200 feet deep, capped with a steel plate and a $2,400 invoice. 3 gallons a minute, 14 feet. The water's not at the bottom of the mountain, Randall. It's in the middle. It flows sideways through a fracture zone at the contact between the hard gneiss and the weathered rock above. The fracture zone is 60 feet below the ridge and 14 feet below the surface at this location because the hillside is steeper here and the overburden is thinner. I drilled at the ridgetop, straight down through solid gneiss. You drilled through the impermeable layer, the layer the water flows on top of. You went through the floor. The water is on the floor, not under it. You could drill to 500 feet at the ridgetop. and never hit the fracture zone, because the fracture zone is lateral, not vertical. It runs along the mountain, not through it. The Hydrogeological Survey said to drill at the ridge. The survey assumed a vertical water table. This mountain doesn't have a vertical water table. It has a perched aquifer, a tilted layer of water sitting on top of an impermeable bed, flowing sideways until it exits on the hillside. The survey measured the right mountain with the wrong model. You drilled where the model said to drill. I dug where the mountain said to dig. Where the mountain said to dig, you dug based on the seep line. I dug based on what my grandfather showed me and what I've watched for 50 years. The seep line marks where the water crosses the surface. The seep line on Bull Mountain runs at about 2,800 feet elevation, following the contour. Wherever the seep is strongest, wherever the wet ground is most concentrated, that's where the fracture zone is closest to the surface. That's where you dig, not at the ridge top where the water enters the rock, at the hillside where the water exits the rock. Randall stood at the spring box and listened to the water flow. He'd been drilling wells in Patrick County for 19 years. He'd drilled 400 wells. Approximately 340 had hit water. An 85% success rate that was considered excellent in the industry. The 60 dry holes, including Clyde's, were chalked up to bad luck, bad geology, the unpredictable nature of fractured rock aquifers. But standing at Clyde's Spring, listening to 3 gallons per minute flowing from a hand-dug excavation 14 feet deep, 300 yards from a $2,400 dry hole that went 14 times deeper and found nothing, Randall began to reconsider his 60 dry holes. How many of them were drilled at ridge tops on mountains, where the water moved laterally? How many of them were in formations, where the aquifer was perched on a tilted, impermeable layer instead of sitting in a horizontal water table? How many of those dry holes were dry not because there was no water, but because the drill was pointing the wrong direction? I drill down. That's what the rig does. It goes straight down. The water goes sideways. That's what the mountain does. Your rig and the mountain are perpendicular. You're looking for a handshake, and you're both reaching in different directions. If you're enjoying this story, consider subscribing to The Average Farmer. We share stories like this every week. Let me tell you about the county health department, because the approval of Clyde's Spring as a private water supply required a fight that tested his patience more than the digging tested his back. The health department's position was clear. A hand-dug spring was not an approved water source. Virginia's private well regulations specified drilled wells with sealed casings as the standard for new domestic water supply. Springs were grandfathered. Existing springs that predated the regulations could continue operating. But new spring developments were not permitted without a variance, and variances required an engineering assessment, water quality testing, and a public hearing. Clyde applied for the variance. He submitted water quality test results. The spring water tested below detection limits for coliform bacteria, below EPA limits for nitrates, and below taste thresholds for iron and manganese. The water was cleaner than most drilled wells in Patrick County because it was naturally filtered through 60 feet of fractured rock before it reached the discharge point. The rock was the filter. The mountain was the treatment plant. He submitted the engineering assessment, a report from a licensed hydrogeologist who confirmed the perched aquifer model, the fracture network, and the flow rate. The hydrogeologist's report included the observation that the Pruitt Spring development intercepts a well-documented perched aquifer system that is inherently protected from surface contamination by 60 feet of overlying bedrock, providing superior source protection compared to a typical drilled well in the same formation. Superior source protection. The spring, the water source, the health department didn't want to approve, was actually safer than the drilled well the health department required, because the spring drew water that had been filtered through 60 feet of mountain. A drilled well at the ridge top would draw water that had percolated through 8 feet of soil, less filtration, less protection, more vulnerability to surface contamination. The variance was approved in September of 1999, 6 months after the dry hole, 3 months after the spring was flowing. The health department inspector who signed the approval noted that the Pruitt Spring was the best protected water source I've inspected in 12 years. Let me tell you about the JD dealer, because the equipment angle completes this story the way every dealer appearance completes these stories, with a man who sells machines discovering that a shovel worked better. Wade Cundiff ran the John Deere franchise in Stewart, the nearest dealership to Bull Mountain. He sold tractors, attachments, and, relevant to this story, backhoe attachments for 3-point hitches. The backhoe attachment that Clyde had used to open the initial trench was a competitor's product. A used unit Clyde had bought at a farm auction for $800. Wade had been trying to sell Clyde a new JD backhoe attachment for $4,200 for 3 years. When Wade heard about the spring, he drove to the Pruitt farm to see it. He expected to find a sophisticated excavation, a deep, machine-dug trench with engineering and equipment. He found a 14-foot hole dug mostly by hand, a concrete spring box, and a ram pump, clicking in the shade of a poplar tree. Clyde, the well driller, went to 200 feet with a $150,000 rig and found nothing. You dug 14 feet with a pick and a shovel and found 3 gallons a minute. I dug in the right place. Randall drilled in the wrong place. The depth doesn't matter if the direction is wrong. A 200-foot vertical hole in the wrong location is a $2. 400 hole in the ground. A 14-foot lateral excavation in the right location is a water supply. You found water that a professional well driller couldn't find. I found water that a professional well driller wasn't looking for. Randall drills vertical wells. The water on Bull Mountain flows horizontally. He was using the right tool for the wrong geology. I used the wrong tool, a pick and a shovel, for the right geology. The geology won. I sell backhoe attachments, the one you used to open the trench. You could have done the whole job with a bigger backhoe. The backhoe dug the first 8 feet through overburden, the last 6 feet through the contact zone and the fracture network. Had to be done by hand. You can't find a 2-inch fracture flowing water with a backhoe bucket. You find it with your hands, your eyes, and your ears. The sound of water in rock is something a machine can't hear, because the machine is louder than the water. The sound of water in rock. You get close to the fracture zone and you can hear it, a trickle, a whisper, water, moving through cracks in stone. It's the sound that tells you to stop digging deeper and start digging wider. The drill rig can't hear it at 200 feet. I heard it at 12 feet because I was standing in the hole with my ear against the rock. Let me tell you about the legacy, because Clyde's spring development influenced how 3 other families on Bull Mountain found water, and none of them drilled wells to do it. In 2001, Clyde's neighbor, Harold Bowman, needed water for a new barn 600 feet from his drilled well. Running a line from the well was expensive, $3,800 in trenching and pipe. Clyde walked Harold's property with him, found a seep line at the same elevation as the Pruitt Spring, 2,800 feet, the same contact zone, and helped Harold dig a spring development identical to Clyde's. 3 days of digging. Flow rate, 2 gallons per minute. Cost, $900 in materials. Harold's barn has had water from that spring for 24 years. In 2003, a family on the south side of Bull Mountain, new landowners from Roanoke who'd bought a weekend property, hired a well driller who went to 280 feet and found nothing. They called Clyde. He walked their land, found the seep line, identified the strongest discharge point, and consulted on the excavation. The spring produced 1.8 gallons per minute at 16 feet. Cost, $1,100. The well driller's invoice, $3,360 for 280 feet of dry rock. In 2005, a church camp on the ridge needed additional water capacity. The camp's existing drilled well produced 1 gallon per minute, barely adequate for 50 campers. Clyde located a spring site on the camp's property, consulted on the development, and the spring produced 4.2 gallons per minute, the strongest flow he'd found on Bull Mountain. The camp's water capacity quadrupled for $1,600 in development costs, 4 springs, 4 water supplies, total depth of all 4 excavations combined, approximately 58 feet, total flow, 11 gallons per minute, total cost, $5,000. The well driller's 2 dry holes on Bull Mountain, 480 feet of depth, 0 gallons per minute, $5,760 in charges for nothing. 58 feet of hand-dug excavation found more water for less money than 480 feet of machine drilling found for more money. Because the water was never at the bottom, it was on the side, and the man who knew the side of the mountain found it every time. Let me tell you how this ends. Clyde Pruitt maintained his spring until 2008, when he was 83. His grandson, Tyler, took over the farm. The spring still flows, 3 gallons per minute, cold and clear, the ram pump clicking on the hillside, pushing water to the house, the same way it has since 1999. The concrete spring box is sound. The fracture network is unchanged. The mountain still delivers water sideways the way it has for 1,000,000 years. The Farmall 560 is in the barn. Tyler uses it for the heavy work. The backhoe attachment, the $800 auction find, is stored on a rack behind the tractor, ready for the next neighbor who needs help finding water that a drill rig can't reach. Randall Combs changed his practice after the Pruitt Spring. He hired a hydrogeologist to consult on mountain sites, the sites where the standard vertical well model didn't apply. The consultant taught Randall to read seep lines, identify perched aquifer indicators, and recommend spring development as an alternative to drilling in formations where the water moved laterally. Randall's dry hole rate on mountain sites dropped from 22% to 6% in 2 years. The reduction came not from drilling better, but from knowing when not to drill at all. Clyde taught me that the drill isn't always the answer. Randall told a well drilling conference in 2004. On Bull Mountain, the answer was a pick, a shovel, and a 74-year-old man who'd been listening to the mountain for 50 years. The water told him where it was. He just had to be quiet enough to hear it. If this story stayed with you, subscribe to The Average Farmer for more. We'll see you in the next one. The driller went deep. The farmer went wide. The water wasn't at the bottom of a hole. It was flowing sideways through the mountain, following tilted rock layers that were laid down 500 million years ago. And the only man who could find it was the one who'd been watching the mountain tell him where it was for half a century. 200 feet straight down, $2,400. Dry, 14 feet sideways, $1,400. 3 gallons per minute. Because the drill assumes the water is below, the mountain knows the water is beside. And the farmer who reads the mountain instead of drilling through it finds the water every time.